Morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Julie Mayo, and I'm a partner in the Global Projects Group at Baker Botts here in Houston. And I'm very... Oh, you can't hear me. Well, that's it. All right. Is this better? There we go. Okay, so you missed the least important part of this entire panel. But I'm Julie Mayo. I'm a partner in the Global Projects Group at Baker Botts here in Houston, and I'm very excited to be here today with this group of panelists to speak about the realities of energy security. And I'm not sure that this panel topic would have been one that we proposed if we were putting this conference together on February 23rd, but the last 7 months have certainly brought energy security issues into very sharp focus. And you know, in general, as I suspect most folks in this room feel, the past few years have really given the energy industry lots to talk about. So from the death of oil and gas in the midst of COVID to a flood of new technologies and excitement surrounding things like hydrogen, ammonia, CCUS, and others, there's really been something for everyone. Part of what we're here to explore today is really the boom and bust cycle of the energy industry. So what was passé and unfashionable and maybe even 3 letters of a dirty word like LNG just a few months ago is now a critical part of the energy transition conversation. For many of you, oil and gas never went anywhere. Like Mark Twain, rumors of its death were greatly exaggerated. But it has experienced a so-called resurgence, and in any event has managed to claim its rightful place as an integral part of the energy mix and the energy transition. And we're fortunate to have panelists with us here today with diverse perspectives on what the energy security issues look like and what the role of various resources and technologies might be now and in the future. So by way of introduction, with us today we have the Honorable Dan Brouillette, who is president of Sempra Infrastructure and the former U.S. Secretary of Energy. We have Anna Mikulska, who is a non-resident fellow in energy studies for the Center for Energy Studies right here at Rice University's Baker Institute. We have Mark Merrill, who currently serves as president and CEO of Uniper North America. And joining us virtually, we have Colin Parfit, who is vice president of midstream at Chevron. So I'd like to begin by giving each of our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their roles in the industry and their thoughts on the importance of energy security, and maybe even a little bit about the role of oil and gas in that regard. So Dan, if we could start with you, please.
Well, thank you, Julie. Oh, is this on? I don't know if it's on.
You have to get very close.
No, there it is. There it is. Well, thank you, Julie. I appreciate that introduction and the opportunity to be here today. Thank you, Ken. Thank you to everyone at the Baker Institute for the invitation. You have a proud and distinguished history, and I'm honored to be a part of your conversation today. The state of the market is pretty interesting, to say the least. During my time as Secretary of Energy, I spent a lot of time in Europe talking about the things that we're watching on TV this morning. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next couple minutes. But I want to give you just a quick introduction to what I'm doing now outside of government life. As Julie mentioned, I'm the president of Sempra Infrastructure, which is a company that is a subsidiary of Sempra Energy in San Diego. Sempra Energy is a holding company that owns 2 of the larger utilities in the country today, San Diego Gas and Electric, as well as Southern California Gas, SoCal Gas. It also owns Oncor here in Texas, so it's an 80% owner of Oncor here in Texas. The 4th leg of that stool is the company that I help run here from Houston. And it's the old Sempra LNG business combined with assets that we owned in Mexico. We've combined all of these assets together: energy trading, renewable generation in Mexico, LNG export facilities in Cameron, Louisiana, where I'm originally from, as well as right here in Texas. Port Arthur is a project that we're developing, and we have some West Coast facilities as well. To say it's a good time to be in the LNG business would be an understatement. What's happening in Europe today, I think, is driving us to understand, perhaps more acutely than we have in the past, the need for balance in our energy policy between energy security and the climate goals and the environmental security that we also all want. I am pleased by that rebalancing. I think it's long overdue, candidly. And I think that as we stand here in our business, in the LNG business, we have an important role to play in that rebalancing. When I look at the demand curves, when I look at the demand and I look at the population growth and the economic growth around the world, LNG is going to be a component of our energy portfolio, at least for the remainder of my lifetime. And I would dare say for the lifetime of most of the people in this room. I've not yet seen a credible economic study that suggests that the demand for LNG is going to fall off within the next 2 decades at a minimum, and it's probably longer than that. So we're excited to be in this business. We're excited to be a part of this equation of balancing energy security and climate security, or environmental security, however you want to define it. And I look forward to the conversation that we're going to have today.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. Anna?
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm truly honored to be part of this panel. And I'm a fellow here at the Baker Institute, and my focus is actually geopolitics of energy, particularly geopolitics of gas, natural gas in Russia and Eurasia and the region. So I've been very bored last 6 months. Yes, incidentally only here. So I've been looking at this issue of energy security for a very long time, actually, much longer than since the 24th or the 23rd of February. Also because I'm Polish, and what I kind of want to get into is the differences that actually exist in the way Europe has seen energy security and has seen geopolitics as part of the energy security equation. And there has been a very distinct difference between the West and the East of Europe and how energy security was approached. In a way that both of the regions are quite developed. So the availability, accessibility, and affordability of energy, that kind of the three A's, were there. And in many ways, that was kind of given. People haven't thought about it much. We generally know, just like here in the US, that the energy is there whenever we want to plug our iPhone. And it's most likely not gonna go away. We will be able to charge it. But there was one more part where there has been a big difference in the way that people have seen energy that comes to Europe. And that's the fourth A in the energy security equation, the acceptability. And in the West, often the acceptability meant, well, we really need to make sure that we're gonna get rid of fossil fuels, replace it with renewable energy, make sure that we run on clean energy. And Germany has been probably one of the biggest proponents. In Germany, actually, you end up actually also with the issues of acceptability of nuclear power that added to the issues that actually the country is experiencing today. But in the east of Europe, the acceptability issues, the biggest ones, were actually where that energy is coming from. And the biggest, of course, issue was that much of the energy that would come to the region was coming from Russia. And that's what those countries didn't like. They didn't like that they haven't been diversified in terms of the resources that they are getting, and depend on energy for energy on Russia that they did not trust. The trust has been a very different issue for the West, in particular in natural gas, because West has been working with natural gas and Russia for decades, since 1970s, and haven't seen the disturbances that we've seen now. So Russia was acceptable source for the West and not so much for the East. Currently, this has changed. The idea of acceptability has changed dramatically. I would say the West in the West more so. In the East part of Europe, it's been kind of reassured. But of course, Russian energy has become less acceptable. Sometimes it's needed, but not necessarily wanted. And also the fact that we need to or use all of the above to ensure that all the three other A's are there, the availability, accessibility, and affordability. So we not only need to diversify away from Russia or diversify into many different resources, but also into many different fuels, and potentially that's what is going to be something that will level. That will allow the developed world maybe level with the developing world that has known this all along. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Mark?
Well, that was easy. I agree with everything they both just said. My name is Mark Merrill. I am the CEO of Uniper North America. Uniper may not be a familiar name to many of you. I know it is to Anna. We are Gazprom's largest customer. We pull more gas out of Russia, or did pull more gas out of Russia than any other company. We were there in 1970. Rugas signed those contracts. So we are. Our visibility has increased greatly in the last 6 months. We are right in the middle of it. So hopefully, thank you for the opportunity to speak today, because I think it's absolutely a relevant topic for our organization. Uniper, just a little more background. We're one of the largest power producers in Europe. We have 34 gigawatts of diversified generation, mostly in northwestern Europe, but also in Russia. We have the largest gas portfolio, one of the largest gas portfolios in Europe, a global LNG business. We pull LNG out of Freeport, or hope to do so again soon, hopefully in November. But we're also attempting to diversify. Uniper has an interesting history. It was actually created by the energy transition when E.ON spun us off. E.ON is one of the largest utilities in Europe. Spun us off in 2016, and a lot of people named us the bad bank, because we represented the old traditional energy world with our conventional generation, with our fossil fuel footprint. But key and core to our business was security of supply. That's essentially what we represented. That's what we represent today. So that is clearly in our core. But we also knew, we knew there was going to be a bridge. The transition is a bridge, but we wanted to be on the other side of that bridge as well, not just be the bridge to the new energy world. So we very quickly started to diversify, started our own renewable development capability, but also particularly got into a number of areas with green gases, particularly hydrogen, ammonia. So we're working on a number of those projects. So I really do think security of supply is obviously the primary concern right now, and we'll talk about that further, and it should be. But I don't think we can go away from the green transition. The green transition is going to happen, and I think they need to happen not just in parallel, but they complement each other. I think you need both. It's essential, and I think we can do both. We have to. And I know Uniper is right there and wants to participate, is participating, and wants to participate in the future in that transition. And I think we have a role to play. So thank you very much, Baker, the Baker Institute, and Baker Botts, for giving us the opportunity. I very much look forward to the conversation we're about to have.
Thanks, Mark. And now we'll turn it to Colin. Are you able to hear us, Colin?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me, Julie?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay, good. Hey, well, look, hey, thank you. And look, I also thank you, to Baker Institute and Rice University for both hosting the event, but secondly, allowing me to join in virtually. Look, I am not far away from anybody else. I'm here in Houston. Unfortunately, I picked up a virus, which many of you may have had, and so it's best that I'm not with you in person. But look, I'm really, really pleased to join you. And look, let me introduce myself. I'm Colin Parfitt from Chevron. I head up our midstream business in Chevron. So first, that's pipeline power, our trading organization, and shipping. But I'm also on the executive committees in Chevron. So I kind of think more broadly in the energy space. And look, if I build on, some of the things that, Anna and Mark have just said, one of the things that we think about is affordable, reliable, ever cleaner energy, and trying to get those three things working together. And if I go back over the last few years, there's lots of talk about ever cleaner, and as we move to the energy transition, those first two bits about affordability and reliability have sometimes been assumed. And if I think about reliability, like energy security in Europe, that's actually now a huge issue. So if, I think really simplistically I think what does the consumer want to do? They want to be able to turn a light switch and the light to go on to fire up whatever energy system they get and get heat. And, there are times, looking at a Houston audience during hurricanes, winter storms, that can be challenged here. It's going to be significantly challenged in Europe over the next winter or maybe the next few winters. So there is a real issue about reliability and energy security. And then all of that, if I think about affordability, is against this backdrop where we've got high commodity prices, oil, gas, coal. Essentially we've got high commodity prices for everything. So if I think about affordability, reliability, ever cleaner, All of those things have got issues at the moment, but essentially all of those three things need to be worked together. So look, with that, I'm really happy to be on this panel, very happy to join in the rest of the conversation. So Julie, I'll hand it back across to you.
Well, while we have you, Colin, why don't we start with you for the next question? So
Okay.
I'm going to get right into the nitty gritty and ask one of the more important questions I think that you've all alluded to and that we're all dealing with. We've talked about the 4 A's, right? We've talked about balance. We've talked about the challenges associated with that. If you look back at your priorities, even just 7 months ago, how have they changed? And how do you rebalance? Let's talk about pragmatically and specifically, how are we thinking about balancing all 4 of these incredibly important objectives to make sure that we get where we want to go, wherever that may be? And so, Colin, if we could start with you, please.
Yeah, no, Julie, thank you. Look, I'll try and be fairly short, but look, we're in a long-term business, and so there's a little bit that you try not to, turn too quickly depending on current market dynamics. But no, there clearly has been some change. So if I think about what we're doing, so I think about Chevron as a company, 2 bits of our business. We've got a big oil and gas business. We're trying to grow that oil and gas business, but critically, as we try and grow it, we're reducing the carbon intensity of it. So essentially, our view is the world needs more energy. Clearly, it needs more gas at the moment, and so there's plenty of gas in the United States, and it needs enabling through infrastructure, through LNG plants, and ships through regasification to get to Europe. So you see more there, but essentially that's all about how do you increase the supply of energy the world needs, but at the same time do things to reduce carbon emissions. So I'd call it, that's kind of how we think about the traditional business. There is a newer business, new energies, and look, for us internally, we're focused on renewable fuels, hydrogen, carbon capture offsets. What we're not really focused on as a company is electrification. Other people are. We're focused on what we call some of the harder to abate sectors, some of the big industrial sectors, some of the heavy transportation sectors where electrification probably is not the answer, and you've got to think about something else. And then there's a whole bunch of technologies that you have to do. So if you think about then current your markets, you've got energy crisis in Europe, you've got high prices. There's a key, reliability is key. So running your existing equipment as well as you can so that you produce energy today is key. You also have to think about tomorrow, and tomorrow is enabling some of that gas supply, particularly in the United States, so it can flow to Europe. That's part of the solution. And the other part of the solution is thinking about increasing in the new energy space. So broadly, that's kind of how we think about it. And I would argue that, there's not an enormous change in the last 7 months. It might be a slight change of emphasis.
Thank you. Anybody else thinking about balancing all of those different competing priorities?
Yeah. I mean, from our side, we've been, the 7 months, I think we're calling, it's been a crisis. I mean, clearly, it was a crisis a little bit before February 24th as well. If you remember the volatility that was happening in the energy market, it didn't start on February 24th, but certainly went to a different level at that point in time. So what we've been really focused on is security of supply. We are critical, and I think that is seen by the support that the German government is going to provide our organization, critical to the supply of energy into Germany and into Europe. So we've worked on a number of different things. That includes diversification. We take pipeline gas already from other places than Russia, from Norway, from the Netherlands, Azerbaijan. We're looking for other opportunities to bring pipeline gas into Europe. LNG, we've got a global LNG portfolio where we take LNG from the United States, from Qatar, from Australia. We're looking at other opportunities, particularly here in North America, to take more gas over to Europe. Don't forget coal. I mean, the coal market was broken before the gas market was broken, and we needed to turn back on some of our mothballed coal plants. We need to make sure that we had coal to run. That didn't help if you saw the drought that was going on for the last few months in Europe over the summer. When I went back to Düsseldorf and the Rhine was completely dry and the grass was all brown, that was a big problem, both for some of the nuclear plants, the cooling of those plants, but also for getting the commodity that we needed to our power plants, but we've done that. So we've really focused, and then not to mention filling our storage back up. I mean, that was a key issue that continues to be a key issue in Europe. The German government came out with a very ambitious requirement to get those storage filling levels up to 95%. We're going to meet that, and that's going to be essential for this winter. Let's see about next winter, because I think we're all realizing that next winter is going to be just as critical as this winter. So that's what we've really been focusing on for the short-term perspective. But we haven't also at the same time forgot about the long-term perspective, and been having some conversations both on long-term supply of LNG from various countries, but also hydrogen and ammonia offtake. So we signed an MOU with a project up in Canada. We were up in Canada with Chancellor Schultz and Prime Minister Trudeau, and with Germany signed a hydrogen MOU with the Canadian government. We're working on that. We signed an MOU with JERA for a potential ammonia offtake and LNG from the United States, and we signed a long-term contract with Woodside for further LNG volume. So we're crystallized, or we're very focused on the near term, getting through these next couple of winters, but also understanding, laying the foundation for the future. And just to mention also infrastructure, that was another thing. I think infrastructure is very important. We've had a site, Wilhelmshaven, also almost since the 1970s, that we've on and off considered to import LNG, and finally it's getting going. So we've procured a couple FSRUs for the German government together with our peers. I think we have a total of 5 now coming in into Germany pretty soon, but then we'll also turn Wilhelmshaven finally into a regas facility for LNG, but with the ability also to convert that to ammonia for the long term, because like we said, we need to transition, and it was very important for the German government, I believe, to have that capability, so that they had a line of sight for something beyond fossil fuels. So it's been a very difficult 7 months, I will tell you that. I don't think it's over. It's not over. I think the pain is going to come, particularly to end consumers in Europe. But I think we need to stay focused and united, all of us, in solving this problem.
You raise an important point there, Mark, which I think would be maybe another A word, which is adaptability, and the importance of being able to have flexible assets and a flexible view toward the future. Dan, did you have some thoughts on that too?
I think I agree with where Mark was going and where Colin was going as well. I mean, I'll speak for Sempra Infrastructure. Our basic business proposition, if you will, is that we can meet the goals of the increased demands of energy with natural gas and the environmental goals, because to the extent that natural gas replaces coal, we see real, measurable, tangible environmental benefit to that. So that part of our strategy has not changed. We believe strongly in that. We also believe in what is commonly referred to as the energy transition, although we may define it a little differently from time to time. When I think about the history, and I've talked to a number of you in the audience about this, you think about the history of energy, it's rarely, if ever, been a transition from one fuel to another. That hasn't happened at all, at least maybe with the possible exception of whale oil, but that is still used as well in parts of the world. But if you think about the history of humanity, we started off burning wood. Well, today we burn more biomass wood, if you will, than we did 1,000 years ago. We moved to a more efficient fuel source, coal. We burn more coal today than we did just 10 years ago or 100 years ago. We burn more natural gas. We burn more oil. We burn more, we use more nuclear energy. And of course, we've added renewable capacities, at a very high rate as well, which is all good. But if you think about that transition, it's not from one fuel source to another. It's really from less energy to more energy. We're just adding energy to the entire portfolio. So that's why, when I think about Sempra Infrastructure and where we are and the needs of Europe and, frankly, the needs of the United States as well, it's important that we support all forms of energy and that we bring all of this to the marketplace. Now, that being said, we are also doing things, as Mark alluded to and as Colin has alluded to, like these other companies, to decarbonize or at least mitigate some of the carbon emissions that we as an industry contribute to the environment. So we filed Class 6 permits, EPA permits for a facility in Louisiana. It's right in the Hackberry area, if you're familiar with that, near the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The geology there is near perfect for the permanent storage of carbon. So our intent is to work with our partners to capture the carbon off of our Cameron LNG facility and then permanently store it right there. Allows us to put a greener molecule into the marketplace. Those types of activities we continue in Sempra Infrastructure and will continue. And I would dare say almost regardless of what the incentives may be. I know the Congress just acted to increase the 45Q credits and other things. We're going to do it regardless because we think it's the right thing to do. As I think back, though, about this, this move forward, I appreciate the would it be the fifth A or the fourth A? I guess the fifth A of adaptability. One of the things that we're doing as well is to prepare for what may be the next fuel source, if it's hydrogen or if it's ammonia. And we're using our own infrastructure and investing today to ensure that it has that adaptability and that dual use capability, if you will. So those are all important steps that I think we're taking. But the fundamental point is that we're going to continue to make more energy. We're going to continue to produce more energy. We're going to do what we have to do to develop the infrastructure to ensure that that energy actually reaches the markets. So that's our goal at Sempra Infrastructure. If I would say if anything's changed in the last 7 months, it's the speed at which we're doing this. Germany has been great. I've talked to Minister Habeck a few times. I mean, they, in essence, wiped away all of their regulatory structures in order to allow these projects to move at a rapid pace. I applaud that. I think it's important that we do that, just given the acuteness of the situation that we face today as a world. So the speed has changed quite dramatically, but the basic business premise stays the same.
Thanks for that, Dan. And I appreciate you making the point about needing every therm. That's kind of how we talk about it at Baker Botts. So I think that's a really important point to make. So Anna, you alluded in your opening remarks a little bit to the difference between West and East in Europe. And that's one distinction, right? There's also a distinction between global West and East. In terms of, energy mixes, views on energy security, the use of energy as a foreign policy tool. So do you have any thoughts about what might be brewing for the rest of 2022, the winter, as we look at kind of differing perspectives both across Europe and across the world?
Well, it's not going to be an easy winter, obviously, and as Mark has mentioned, there might be more of those winters to come, just because of how difficult it's going to be to reorganize the energy system. So when, 7 months ago, I was looking at Nord Stream 2, just like I'm looking now, but I was looking at it in a very different, and Nord Stream 1, and a very different kind of outlook. It's like, well, how do we make sure that those pipelines are not going to be a way for Russia to make Europe more dependent or use it as a geopolitical tool. At this moment, we know they have been used in many ways, shapes, and forms, so we're looking at them differently. But what also has happened is that 7 months ago, we were thinking about how to incorporate Russian energy in Europe in particular. Now we're thinking how to replace it completely, and that's a huge change that will not happen from one day to another, and that will actually cause a lot of pain, both in terms of ability to heat your house at an affordable rate, but also going forward in economic terms. So we already know that a lot of industry in Europe, in Germany especially, has been having issues, and some of it may never return. This is something that is going to reverberate throughout the European and world economy for many years from now. So that's something that we look for, and the ability of using energy as a foreign policy tool. It's very different in the East in terms of course, in terms of Russia and West in terms of U.S. in particular. But it's really quite valuable experience that quite a valuable part that U.S. can play, provided given that the energy that U.S. provides is not really related directly to the policy, but it's related to the market. So yeah, we know that markets are not predictable necessarily, but that we know also how they work. They work on the basis supply and demand. Whereas if we depend on governments to set up energy flows based on their policy, we really cannot expect, we can expect anything or everything. And that predictability is decreasing, particularly if those governments are like that of Russia. So that's I think it's quite important to underscore that, yeah, markets are imperfect, they're difficult to predict, like previously somebody was saying about, really not trying to predict long term. But at the very least, we know the factors that influence markets. We often don't know what influences policymakers in many countries that own quite a lot of energy resources.
I think that's an important point. And, policy and governments can be very helpful and they can be very harmful, right? And we've seen examples of both, I think. We've seen examples of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which may spur significant additional investment. We've seen attempts of, some of our elected officials to, support U.S. industry in an attempt to also help our allies abroad. But there has to be coordination between industry and government. And so maybe I'm looking at you, Dan, thinking maybe you might want to lead us off on this one, but kind of, and I'm not putting you on the spot, but the idea would be, how can we effectively, kind of manage that interplay between governments and markets?
Well, I think there's an obligation on both sides. I mean, I do think there's an obligation on the side of industry to interact with the government, to be a part of the process, to be a part of the conversation that happens in places like Washington or in Austin or in state capitals around the rest of the country. You think about yourself as an educator in that role, not so much as a politician. When you go into a political office, you're not there really to talk about a campaign or talk about other things. You're there to educate. If you think about the system we have here in the United States, you can go from being a fireman to being the President of the United States. That's the beauty of our system. Well, if that happens, you probably don't know much about the business that all of us are in. So take the time and engage. The obligation is also on the other side. I mean, one of the more important things that I thought that I did as secretary and even as deputy secretary was to reach out to the industry, make sure they were coming in, to make sure that I understood what was their business plan, what was their business model, what was important to them. And that obligation goes both ways. And today I think we maybe have lost a little bit of that in terms of our political debates here in the United States. It tends to be more polarized than I personally think it needs to be, especially with regard to these issues. But that obligation goes both ways. But I also think too, back to my history, before the DOE and all of that, I spent some time on Capitol Hill. I was the chief of staff director, if you will, to the Energy and Commerce Committee. And we helped write the 05 Energy Policy Act, which governs a lot of the business that I happen to now help run. The point of that is, back then, and perhaps before, we tended to focus on common goals first, and then everything else went to the margins. And today, I think we start at the margins and try and find our way back to the middle. And the process seems a little bit backwards. What we did back then was to focus on, to your point, Julie, was, we need every therm. So every conversation that began, whether you were on either side of the aisle, began with, how do we produce more energy? Because our population's growing, we want our economies to grow, we want our country to be a good trading partner with all of our allies. We have a foreign policy element to this that is important to us. But we started with that common goal, more energy. We need more energy. How we get there, we can debate around the margins, but more energy. And I think that's a place that we need to get back to here in the United States. And I think as we think about the rest of the world, that approach begins to solve. It doesn't solve all, but it begins to solve many of the challenges that we face today.
Thank you for that. All of you have really touched on infrastructure and the importance of infrastructure in addressing some of these issues. And as we all know, infrastructure is very expensive. And when we're talking about one of the sub-themes of this panel, which is what's old is new again, we're anticipating a significant amount of continued investment in the United States on oil and gas infrastructure. We're also trying to address both short and long-term energy security issues. And so how do you think about the development of such capital-intensive projects with long-term goals and objectives, and balancing that with solving for short-term problems? Will the time be right when some of these projects come online? And So maybe if you could get out your crystal ball. I don't know if you want to go first, Colin.
Well, no, I was just thinking, Julie, so thank you on your thought, is the timing right? And I was kind of looking at Mark and thinking about his comments on Germany. Unfortunately, yeah, I mean, you're right, developing infrastructure takes some time. And so if I just think about the Europe issue at the moment, where Europe is short gas because of the lack of flow from Russia coming across, my view is there is plenty of gas in the world, and a lot of it here in the United States, but actually some of it's, underground to be developed. And it can all get to markets like Europe, but you have to create the infrastructure. So you have to create the pipelines, you have to connect the LNG plants, the ships, the regas terminals, and make all of that work. It's all doable, but those are, let me say 3 years if you're really quick and you've got a standing 5-year type thing. So over time, you can do it. And I mean, look, to Dan's point, and look, Dan did a really good job when he was in government of doing just what he described of listening and connecting with the industry. I mean, we do have an issue in the United States around permitting of this and just the time it takes to permit infrastructure. And I think one of the things if I think about partnership between industry and government, it would be to do something about the speed of that. Because that's true on an example I was giving, which was really a gas to LNG markets issue. But that issue about how do you create the new infrastructure, that's true with new energies as well. So whether we were thinking about developing a gas pipeline or a CO2 pipeline or hydrogen, or if you were thinking about long distance electricity, all of that has the same issue, is that we actually have to figure out how to permit and get that infrastructure to work so that we get the energy the world needs for tomorrow in the right place for us. So yeah, it's capital, it's long term, and it's a partnership between industry and government that will make that happen.
If I could jump in there, I mean, I think 2 points. First, on the permitting, I completely agree, and I go back to what Dan said about Minister Habeck, and you have to remember that the Minister of Economics and Energy is also the head of the Green Party. But the pragmatism the pragmatism with which he's acted over the last 6 months is very commendable. I mean, we've been flying around sourcing LNG, turning those coal plants back on. This week was a decision to extend the life of the nuclear plants. Probably another one's going to get turned on or kept on. I mean, I think that is the kind of thing that we need going forward at all levels, and particularly also here in the United States. I mean, it is I like that. We have to agree on a common goal and all agree that we have to give and take to get there. I think it's very important, because that goes into the other question. If you asked me last year, probably not on February 23rd, but a year ago, what is the biggest issue that we had in getting the energy transition done? It was financing, right? The banks, we all know we need that bridge, but nobody wanted to touch the bridge. They all wanted to touch the other side of the bridge. And
that's hard to do.
And now, I mean, I think you see a little bit of movement, but there is still a hesitancy. I'm sure every one of your companies out here is committed to some kind of carbon neutrality by 2040, 2050. And there is this concern about how long, these are big projects that we're doing here. We're asking for long-term 20-year commitments for some of these things. And I think we have to get a consensus around, we have to come together and say, look, we all understand, we all want to go to the same place, a greener world, but we have to commit maybe to the timelines that we weren't ready to commit to 6, 12 months ago to get there. I think it's very important.
I agree with you, Mark. I think it's, in a perfect world, in a vacuum perhaps, we could think about this, again, to use that word transition as, some sort of bridge in the middle. The problem is that we're not living in a vacuum. We're not living in a perfect world. I mean, there are externalities today. The announcements by NATO that potentially the Nord Stream pipeline was sabotaged. That's now going to be off the market for a long time. So what are we going to do to replace that gas in Europe? And, the debates around whether gas is good or bad, or whether, this technology is good or bad, or this fuel source is good or bad, I personally think needs to be set aside for a moment in time. And we need to understand that the needs of the population, the needs of the citizens around the world must come first. And I applaud what Germany did, I said earlier. I also applaud what other governments are doing around the world. I just returned from Asia last week, And they're doing much the same in places like Japan. They've made fundamental decisions to restart their nuclear power, to bring those reactors back online, because they do not want the lights to go off. And I think that's exactly the right decision. So we have to focus again on the production of energy. How do we get more? How do we make it resilient? How do we make it safe, secure first? And then we'll work at the margins to figure out what the longer term should look like.
If I could add, actually, kind of looking at the bright side to an extent, being the Pollyanna and not only Anna, on this, there is a lot to be said about the fact that many of the developed countries that thought they are done with coal and fossil fuel and kind of really divesting from fossil fuels now are in the point that they actually have to invest in them, but they are not ready to get away go away with the goals of decarbonization. And what means we should see more focus, more investment into the decarbonization technologies, like CCUS, like others, that would never or would take a much longer time to develop in places that are not as well developed, like places in Asia that will continue, as we know, to use fossil fuels for decades to come. So if that's the case, maybe we are at the point where those technologies will develop because there are going to be resources, there's going to be R&D, there's going to be the brain power, and they're going to become scalable and then put in other places that otherwise would not be able to have them. And in that way, actually get some more of decarbonization goals that we would have in those regions that are growing in populations, that are growing in energy use going forward.
You went exactly where I was going to go with that, Anna. And it almost kind of harkens back to some of what we heard on the prior panel about leapfrogging. Right? Some of the same ideas about what development looks like and what energy security looks like as some of these lower carbon projects are, maybe workshopped in the developed world and then brought to other parts of the world. I think several of you have mentioned the fact that we all have net zero targets, or we all have lower carbon commitments that we've made publicly. This has become a very important part of ESG policies for companies, new SEC reporting requirements. It's really come to the forefront. And as we sat here last year, that was a hot topic. Who's made a commitment and what type of a commitment have they made, both at the government level and at the corporate level? And a lot of what we're seeing now is a little bit of a struggle in balancing those not necessarily competing objectives, but making sure that we're making good on our commitments at the same time as we are expanding, all of the terms that are available. So how, if at all, and particularly considering that that's both a short-term piece and a long-term piece, right? We've seen some flexibility on some of those targets in the short term, but there is suspicion or hesitancy about whether that same flexibility will extend to longer-term contracts. And we need long-term contracts to support some of the infrastructure investment. And so how do you see some of those issues playing out together to support the investment in infrastructure that we need with that uncertainty?
That's a good question. I think that's a good question. It's really early in the process too, I suppose. So predictions will be way off the mark, I'm almost certain. We at Sempra are seeing, some reversion back to longer term contracts. Earlier this year, last year, we started to see some shortening of the timetables, particularly from European customers, wanting, very near-term contracts in order to meet a 2030 goal or perhaps some other goal that they had set internally with the company. But we're starting to see a reversion back to the longer-term contracts. 15 and 20 years have been the industry standard, and we're starting to see that come back. And, as you mentioned, without that, it's very, very difficult to finance some of these large infrastructure projects, especially here in the United States, or really anywhere, but especially here in the United States, given the other economic factors that we're dealing with, things like inflation rates of 7% plus, looking at the tightness in the labor markets. I grew up down in this area, not far from here in Louisiana. I grew up a pipeline welder. I kind of wish I was still in the business because those guys are making a lot of money today. The labor market is very tight, and they can name their price. But that creates another inflationary pressure that we're seeing. But all of those things are externalities that we can deal with as an industry. I go back to what was talked about earlier. One of the things that I think we need to really, really focus on, and it's related to the ESG movement, is the permitting process here in the United States. We need to do something seriously about NEPA and NEPA reform. I see my friend George Fibby in the front row here, an expert trial attorney, somebody who's in court all the time and would argue every day that you need your day in court. But I would ask George, do you need 4 or 5 bites at the apple at the same question?
He would say yes.
It's important that we look at these processes and, of course, let people avail themselves to the court system to resolve any grievances they may have. But we can't allow an extended 20, 30, 40-year process to unfold in the courts. As some in the industry have said, I forgot exactly, I don't know where the quote's from, it takes longer to permit some of these projects than it actually takes to build them. If that's truly where we are, then we have a problem and we need to address it squarely.
Maybe one thing we could do, and I think we're doing a very good job of it, I don't remember what panel it was yesterday, but somebody talked about the methane emissions from Russian gas. And that was actually something the Russians often used, was saying that their gas was cleaner than the U.S. gas.
Sure.
Whether that's true or not, I have my doubts. But I think something that we're really working hard on as an industry here in North America is cleaning up that gas system. And then once we clean that up, we have to educate our customers across the globe, particularly in Europe, about how we're doing, what we're doing to reduce methane emissions, what is the actual environmental impact of fracking. I heard, and I'm pretty sure this is correct, that 89 to 90% of all the gas in our pipeline system is frack gas, and it surprises some Europeans. But we need to go out there and educate people, because I think that's very important. And I think it has changed some minds. Now, obviously, the current events have changed some minds, but particularly when you get over there and you start talking to people about what we're doing, they get more comfortable with it, and I think that will help get them comfortable with signing some of these longer-term contracts that they need.
Yeah, we agree as well, Mark. We are very active in the conversations to determine, I guess what's commonly referred to as the life cycle analysis of our projects in the gas, and very committed to both, methane reductions, but also just quantification of what's actually happening. As you all know, a lot of this is, it's estimates that we're dealing with from time to time. So if we can get to a point where we can actually quantify the carbon intensity of a molecule, we think that provides the right information to the marketplace so that consumers can make the right decisions over time. And perhaps even we can move away from, this color scheme that we deal with all the time: green, turquoise, pink, purple, whatever. What's green here in the United States may not be green in Europe. What's green in Europe may not be green in Asia. So if we can move away from that to a pure quantitative, mathematical, precise measurement of carbon intensity, I think that serves the market really well.
Hey, Julie, if I could just jump in, I'm going to agree to a couple of points that Dan and Mark have made. Look, I build on Dan's point, completely agree. As an industry, we need to get better. There are good things going on, but, really making sure we measure and reduce the emissions of our current business is key. But, going back to your earlier question, where around long term, look, I agreed with what Dan says. We are seeing more customers now go and look for long-term LNG. Interestingly, one of the things that's happening is there's some of that coming from Asia. And if I think, going back, and again, Dan, you mentioned this earlier, if you think about what both the United States and Europe has done over time to reduce its carbon dioxide emissions, one of the big things it's done is it has substituted coal and substituted that for gas in natural power. Asia's kind of got that game ahead of it, and you absolutely see that. So you see demand for gas increasing in Asia. And so one of the things that, to think about, and, to Mark's point, is for Europe is making sure that Europe actually has the the right or kind of thinks about this in a connected fashion, because there's a little bit of competition at the moment coming from Asia in terms of thinking about how do you think about long-term LNG. So and Anna, you talked about east-west split. You start to see that a little bit in the markets at the moment, where you kind of get a slightly longer-term view from, I'll call it, customers sitting in Asia than you do in Europe. And I completely understand why that is in Europe, because you've got this real short-term crisis that people are trying to get through.
But that's, I don't want to,
No,
if we're
go
out of time,
ahead.
I don't want to belabor the point too much, but it's an interesting thing that's happening in the marketplace today. And I'm not a PhD economist, so please take these comments with a large grain of salt. But it's interesting, as we think about, what's happening in the marketplace with prices. I remember from my days as a young congressional staffer, folks would come in and make the argument that we need to raise the prices of certain products so that we can discourage its use. We would tax certain products in order to take it out of the marketplace. It's interesting today as we look at pricing around the world, high prices in the energy space today is actually creating a reversion to more carbon-intense fuels. So it's working against what some had argued in the years past. And that's why I think as we think about our energy needs, obviously the supply-demand equation, you simply produce more, you reduce the price, perhaps you limit some of that shift to more carbon-intense fuel. So it's a thought. Ponder it. You guys are a lot smarter than I am. Anybody got any comments? Shoot them my way.
Well, since you've mentioned comments, I'm going to need an extra hour of everyone's time because we've gotten some phenomenal questions. And I'm not sure where to start. I want to ask all of these, but we are going to run out of time. So I'm going to start with the one that caught my eye the most just because of the way it's phrased. So assuming that the Russia-Ukraine war is quote-unquote settled, do you see Europe ever going back to Russia for its energy supply?
Yes, if we can't supply enough energy. I don't know how this is going to get settled. Hopefully it's peacefully and soon. But I do think, in order to meet the needs of a growing Europe, there will probably be some Russian energy into the European markets. Will it be, again, a 40-45% dependency? I would suggest no. I don't think that ever happens again. There's been some hard lessons learned here. But, can I see some de minimis amount? Yeah, I can at the margin.
I might jump in because I'm very similar. And my view on this is, if I think about how much gas was going to Europe from Russia pre-Russia-Ukraine, and if we magically stop that war today, which would be great, I don't think that the flow will be anything like it used to be, because essentially trust is broken. And so I think that lack of trust will mean less. I also think that it probably won't be zero, because essentially if it's zero, that means that Russian gas has got nowhere to go until you can build pipelines to China or to somewhere else. So I think there will be an economic incentive. So my sense is if it could end, I think there'll be some, but it will be way less than it were before. And exactly where it balances out, it's a bit hard to tell.
Yeah, and I think it depends how it will be settled, who's going to be in power in Russia, and whether that person or the bloc is going to be acceptable. There is a moral imperative there that we've seen overcome any type of profit imperatives, including companies that backed out from Russia before even their governments acted, so that's important. I think if at any point Europe comes back to bring in Russian supply of gas or any other type of energy, that supply will be heavily backed up. Very different than it was before the war, when you would have actually 4 pipelines of Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 that could bring 110 BCM of gas to Germany directly from Russia, which would be more than half of what Russia supplied yearly to Europe, without any type of backup in terms of LNG terminals and so on. And the idea was, there was a lot of trust that was developed where the German government and German companies trusted Russia to bring that gas, until it didn't. But there was no backup, so there was nothing to replace it, and that's why we saw the scrambling to get the LNG terminals going. And Germany was kind of lucky in the sense because a lot of infrastructure was there, because there have been a lot of talk about how can we get alternative supply, and there were plans in Wilhelmshaven, Brunsbüttel, Stade, all these places where already had some of LNG infrastructure developed. I think Stade or Brunsbüttel actually had some LNG transfers already in terms of the bunkering, so that was helpful, but and I think it won't, any type of energy that comes from Russia won't be left without a backup right now.
Absolutely. So we have multiple questions about nationalization. Well, I'm going to get there. So so some question about the nationalization of the German and French utilities. And, what impact do we think that might have on short-term versus long-term, I guess short-term and long-term impacts, and then also what impact does it have when you are negotiating long-term contracts to potentially support some of these critical infrastructure projects?
Well, I would say from our perspective, the deal that was announced foresees the German government taking 99% of our company, ownership in our company. And it's not complete yet. There's some regulatory approvals that are still outstanding. I mean, it was just announced last week, and as we can see, things are fluid, but we fully expect that to happen in the next, hopefully by Q4, the end of Q4. Now, from what I understand, that our mandate should not change. So everything I talked about here today about continuing to play our role in the German energy system continue. That's why they're investing in this, is because we supply hundreds of utilities in Germany. We supply most of the large industrial customers in Germany with gas. We have the largest, we're the largest operator of gas storage facilities in Germany. We have Wilhelmshaven. We're flying around the world trying to source LNG for Europe. So I think our mandate will stay. So as far as the financing and them standing behind us, I hope it makes things easier, but I have no information what the details are of that. As far as I do think, my personal opinion, as you saw with the EDF example, I do think you'll see much more. Well, you've already seen a substantial amount of government intervention across Europe with the price caps, with the liquidity. My background is trading, so watching what's happening on the energy markets across the world, but particularly in Europe on NASDAQ and EEX and everything, the liquidity requirements. So you see these funds being provided by the German government, by the Finnish government, by the Swedes, by the UK. I think you'll see continual intervention in those types of markets, in the exchanges. I think you'll see continued price caps trying to somehow shield their citizens from these prices that are coming. You'll see that, and I think you will see over the next, again, my personal opinion, you'll see fundamental market redesign of the European gas market, or European electricity market as well. So I think we are going to see an increased level of further government intervention over the next months and years.
So I think we've got time for one more question, and I'm not going to ask this question exactly as it's written. I'll tell you how it's written, but then I'm going to ask a slightly different question. So, and for those of you who submitted questions, and if we don't get to them, I'd certainly encourage you to please come up and chat with our panelists, except Colin. So the question asked was, will Europe survive the winter, and how? And so I'm not going to ask exactly that question, but what that makes me think about is maybe if each of you could give us one positive takeaway from the focus on energy security that you see that might benefit, either from an economic perspective, a policy perspective, kind of a universal perspective. I'd be interested to kind of end on a positive note here. So maybe, Colin, if we could start with you.
Okay, so look, look, if I think about a positive, and I think about the positive of the current crisis, I think it's helped us get to a conversation that says we need to do all of this, and so that yes, we need to think about a cleaner future. We've got to think about energy transitions, but while we're doing that, we actually have to think about energy reliability and affordability and do all of those together. And we had got into, Dan talked earlier on about how people sometimes go to extremes, and so there was we've had some extreme narratives around how you could do this and you could do it tomorrow and it would all be for free. And actually, the system is much bigger and more complex than that. So I think that the positive around the kind of energy security crisis is I think that's helped people to understand that the energy system is really big and that there are a whole bunch of connected things you need to do together to make it work. So look, I'm an optimist. I actually think that we can do all of this. I think we can create a reliable system. I think we can create a cleaner system, and I think it will be affordable. I think we can do all of those three things together. I think this crisis may have helped some people think that you actually have to think, and again, Dan talked about, you have to think about a whole bunch of different forms of energy to make this work, not just one type. So I think that's my positive, is it might help people think about this together as a system.
I agree with all of that, and I am optimistic about Europe's future. It will be a tough winter, perhaps, maybe a tough next winter too, but I think about my grandfather's service in World War II. Europe is a resilient place. They're resilient people. They're going to survive. They're going to do well. They will rebuild. They've done it before. They know how to do it, and this too shall pass. We'll get past it.
Yeah, I think there is a dose of reality that has been injected by the conflict that we see, that we are not immune, all of us, that things happen in the most developed and most wealthy parts of the world. And that also relates to energy. And I think that will help us have a dialogue with those who don't have that energy. Because some of us, as people in Europe, do have that experience of potential scarcity and will look at things differently. So in a way, I think there might be bigger progress and kind of looking forward to different COPs and how the developed and developing countries work together and talk together. Maybe there is going to be a way in which they can level differently and think of different solutions rather than kind of signaling virtue on one side and saying we cannot do anything because we need to develop on the other.
Yeah, Europe will survive this winter. I mean, I think, well, I mean, because of the hard work that's been done over the last 6 months by a number of by everybody. It'll be difficult this winter and next, but they'll get through it. Along those same lines, I mean, I started my career in 2010 in Europe. I've spent most of my career in Europe, and it's been really interesting to see over the last 6 months the fundamental rethink that's gone on by a lot of people. A generation above me, really was focused on that Ostpolitik, that relationship with Russia that's fundamental to the way they thought, and there's a number of different reasons behind it. But the rethink that's gone on, and that has been very, very interesting to watch. But also from like I mentioned earlier, also from some of the people that's main issue was the green transition and everything. They've also had a fundamental rethink, and I think what's going to come out of this is actually an accelerated transition, and I think that's going to be good for everybody. A more pragmatic, accelerated energy transition that is going to include much more sources of energy than what we thought about doing, or many thought about using previously. So I've never been very, very infrequently described as an optimist, but in that respect, I am.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much for your time and for your insights today. This was fascinating, and as you can tell by the number of questions, I think our audience thought so as well. We're going to take a brief 10-minute break before we welcome Secretary Baker to the stage. So thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.